Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer from Rhode Island that has blended her coastal upbringing into gothic horror. She's joining me today to discuss her latest work, The Daughters of Block Island. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Christa Carmen. Christa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 30th day of March 2024. I came across your work on Bookstagram and was lured in by the description of a tale rich with gothic intrigue and the surreal setting of an island that is all but abandoned during the off-season. The familial, dysfunctional dynamics, along with the island gossip that floats around in hushed whispers, created an immersive world for the reader. So I thoroughly enjoyed it and am excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that description was what reeled you in. That was everything I was going for. So that's great to hear.
Well, so the book is about two sisters, Blake and Talia. Blake, who is adopted, manages to secure a copy of her birth certificate and discovers the name of her birth mother, who resides on Block Island, a small island just south of mainland Rhode Island. She goes to Block Island to find her birth mother, but is later found dead in her room at the infamous bed and breakfast named Whitehall. Talia makes a trip to the island after receiving a letter from Blake. The letter was sent the day before Blake's death. And one of the challenges Blake faces right from the start is that she is at the beginning stages of attempting to get sober with legal troubles hanging over her head. Now she is also trying to find her birth mother, a task that has the potential to cause emotional pain. So with all of the outside forces that Blake could fall prey to, what inspired you to also include Blake being able to fall prey to her own self-destructive impulses in the form of a relapse into drug and alcohol use?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think first and foremost is I try to make every one of my characters have at least some backstory. So seeing as Blake was one of the main ones, I really wanted to flesh her out as fully as possible. And, I felt like a large part of the story hinged on Talia caring for her despite never having met her. And I wanted the reader to care for her as well. And then, I just have a lot of experience reading and writing and knowing people in various stages of recovery and substance abuse. So it was just a good way for me to know that I could do a good job fully fleshing her out and making her seem real. And people have all sorts of problems, and there are tons and tons of traumas and things that people go through in life that, can affect them for the rest of their lives. But to me, I feel like, obviously I'm biased with, like I just said, having a lot of experience with it, but I feel like addiction, substance abuse, recovery from that, it just in and of itself is something that's so difficult and so tough to shake that I felt like it was a good way almost like a metaphor for the things that go on in a Gothic novel in and of itself. Like in a Gothic novel, there's a lot of times buried secrets and things that just refuse to stay buried. And that to me is very much what addiction can be.
Yeah, kind of the dynamics going on in an addict's brain. They're dealing with conscious issues like the stress of life, and then unconscious issues, things that have been drilled into them from childhood, or maybe that they're just inherently born with, because there's always some question about, well, is addiction, are people born that way? Do they have to be made that way? And so on and so forth. Kind of almost a separate Gothic horror story taking place within the character's mind.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, you brought it up already regarding the alcohol and drug use. Being in recovery myself, I noticed some very accurate and somewhat obscure references, like the admonition to avoid making any major life changes in the first year of sobriety, and especially the reference to the program of adult children of alcoholics, otherwise abbreviated as ACA, which I'm not sure many people are aware of. If it's not too personal, could you kind of speak on the experience you were talking about, I guess, indirectly with people you know in recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked about this many times in general and other stories that I've written. Last year, my short story, Through the Looking Glass and Straight into Hell, it was published in an anthology of addiction horror stories, and it ended up getting nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. So I spent a lot of time last year, on various podcasts talking about my inspiration for that. And so I've been in recovery myself for 10 and a half years now, and I heard those things myself. I don't go to AA anymore, but it was very, very much a major foundation of several different recovery attempts that I had before finding this grand scale, hopefully forever one. So I had experience going to AA meetings. And then I also was for a number of years a mental health counselor that worked at an inpatient detox. I worked at an inpatient psychiatric unit. I worked at several different methadone clinics. So I have a lot of experience talking with people with substance abuse issues and everything that comes along with that. And just, the crazy things that used to go on in my own brain and still occasionally do. So I'm not 100% convinced that you can only write what you know, as the old adage goes. But I do think there is a level of ease and comfort in writing something that you know really intimately. You can write about it confidently. So I like when I get to do that, because I'm no stranger, nor am I frightened of doing research. Most of the books that I write take a lot of research. So I guess, when it comes to different characters and sometimes getting to throw some substance abuse and mental health issues into the mix, it's a place where I feel like I can write without doing a ton of research.
Definitely. Well, so you said about 10 and a half years?
Yes.
Do you keep track of a sobriety date?
So October, November, December, January, March. So it was October 13th.
October
was my
13th.
10 year. So it's about 10 years and 5 months, a little shy of your 10 and a half years.
Yeah. So we're real close together. Mine's 8/26/12. So at 11, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Very nice. Well, congrats.
Well, congrats to you as well. Do you use it as a reason to buy something for yourself? Because I do. I totally do.
Buy stuff, but I definitely want a little mini celebration. I want to be taken out to dinner, or at least be getting many pats on the back.
Nice.
But I don't know. That's a good point. Maybe next year I'll be you know what? I need to buy myself something.
I mean, it's a birthday, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't get the chips anymore. I don't really do AA, but I do still keep track of it and do still remind myself, don't mess with that.
Yes.
Well, the way the story unfolds is very meta in the eyes of Blake. She feels like she's in a Gothic horror novel because of the characteristics of coming to a mysterious, rain-soaked island and attempting to discover secrets of her past. She even goes so far as to make up rules for surviving a Gothic horror story. So can you tell us about the inspiration for this aspect of the story, this sort of meta existing in a story within a story?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of a twofold answer to that. There were two different like pieces of the inspiration for that. So I really wanted to write a Gothic novel. I grew up reading everything from, full-on horror, thriller, literary, but I always loved a good Gothic horror novel. I love like the isolated setting. I love houses. I finally realized this, I never really said it that bluntly before. Like I was like, oh, I love Gothic and I love that. I love me like a good, huge mansion. If it's crumbling and old, all the better. So, I wanted to write the Gothic novel, and I sat down to write a Gothic novel, and it was painful to write. Like, usually when I write a first draft, I try to get into a good habit of writing like a consistent amount of words every day, so I stay within the headspace of the story. And I was miserable trying to write this book, and I was like, I like the idea, and it's something that I want to pursue. And I realized I was bored, and it was because everything was super cliche. And it was like, how do you do all those pieces of the Gothic novel, but make them new? Because otherwise it's just like you're plugging stuff into the same formula. Like, here's the girl in danger. Here's the creepy decaying mansion. Here's the buried secret. Here's the, supernatural entity that ends up being not supernatural. And I've talked about this a lot, and, not even just in relation to this book, but I think in general over the years of like being interviewed, talking about like final girls and movies I like. I am a fan of the Scream franchise. Sometimes people in the horror community are like, ah. So obviously there's the first Scream, there were the rules of surviving a horror movie, and there's been various other like meta takes on the subsequent Scream films. So when I was sitting there trying to figure out like how to fix this book to make it not so boring, I was like, why can't I just have my characters acknowledging that they're in a Gothic horror novel and like make it meta, like make it Scream. And then I can lean into those tropes, but play with them a little bit. So that was like the first part of the inspiration. But then what happened was, you've read the book, there's some moments of lightheartedness. There's some moments of like a little bit tongue in cheek, like when she talks about the rules of surviving a Gothic horror novel, and she's with sort of this like jovial island drunk, retired nurse, and then they're having fun with it. But it's not like a parody story. So I was like, well, how can I make it meta Gothic and not have it come across as like a big joke, a big parody? And that's actually where these couple last questions come together really nicely, because the fact that Blake was so damaged and so fresh and raw and like this like jittering live wire, I felt like I could use her as my in to the meta Gothic that I wanted to do. So, I mean, the first line of the book is Blake knows she's in a Gothic horror novel the moment she steps off the rain-slicked ferry. And so I figured it doesn't make sense for other characters to think like we're in a Gothic novel, but for her it did, because she just couldn't wrap her mind around how so much has gone so wrong in her life. And now she comes to this island and like, it does not stop raining. There's like practically nobody there. It's creepy. She's staying at this mansion with these like very weird sisters that own it. So I just ran with that. And then it got me able to do that scene in the bar that I just spoke about and make the rules. And then I got to put those rules like on paper, and along with Blake's letter, I could carry that through. And that was like a good way for me to allow Talia to come to know Blake. And she got to know Blake a lot through what Blake believed. And then, of course, Blake's belief that she is possibly in a Gothic horror novel, others saw that. And without spoiling anything too much, people saw her uncertainty and her, I don't want to say naivety, but her just shakiness and her, she felt like she couldn't trust herself. And people saw that and they exploited that belief.
So you talk about the Gothic literature that you read. I always like to ask fans of Gothic literature, V.C. Andrews? And if so, do you read the posthumously published novels?
I don't read any of the posthumously published novels. I've been intrigued several times because like I follow her on Goodreads. Like I'll get the giveaways for the new stuff that's coming out. And I've been intrigued a few times. But yeah, no, of course I read, Flowers in the Attic and read her stuff when I was younger. And yeah, I feel like based on this conversation, because I've been sort of on the fence, I am going to pick up one of them and see what it's all about.
Well, I mean, I had one guest on, I can't remember who it was, but she said she rereads the classics and hate reads the new ones.
That's a good approach. I like that. I feel like it would be a good, I listen to a lot of audiobooks because I commute a lot for work and to bring my daughter to school. I'm in the car a fair amount. So I do a lot of audiobooks, and I feel like those would be good ones, like the new ones to listen to kind of hate listen to.
Yeah. I mean, and she's not saying that they're not good. I guess just kind of the spirit with which they're produced.
Yes, absolutely. I can understand that.
Yeah. Well, so the place where Blake stays upon arriving at Block Island is a bed and breakfast called Whitehall, which oddly enough is owned by two sisters named Eileen and Fiona. Eileen is very friendly, while Fiona is a bit of an ice queen. Could you describe the dichotomy between the two sisters and explain how each of their personalities contributes to the story?
Yeah, so I feel like to answer this question, I have to talk about another influence of the book, which is, and sorry that this seems like such a patchwork explanation for how this book came to be, but this is kind of like how I get all my ideas. It's like little things that stick in my head that I like or that I'm interested in. And it isn't even often that they naturally go together, but because I am so interested and like maybe borderline obsessed, a little bit of the addict personality still existing, and I'm just constantly like turning over these same ideas, I sort of like make them fit together eventually. So it was like, I was working on, I wanted to write a new novel. I wanted to write this gothic novel. And right at the same time, or right around the same time, I was really into, I don't have her name in front of me. I forget the name of the author of the book, but the illustrator of the book is Katie Horan. And the book is Literary Witches. And it's just like a really cool book of illustrations and little write-ups about famous women authors throughout history. And like, it's just like it's almost like a coffee table book. So I had been gifted that. And then I got really into Katie Horan's artwork. And so I was gifted for a birthday a few years back a print of Katie Horan's The Dreadful Wind and Rain is what the print is called. And the print is gorgeous. Like you can look it up online and see it. And it's like of one woman standing over another woman who has drowned in a river and her hair is like turning into flowers. And it's just very cool. So I was like, oh, The Dreadful Wind and Rain. Like I looked it up, of course, because I'm a research nerd, and realized it was a murder ballad. So it's a piece of artwork depicting this murder ballad that is in equal parts called The Dreadful Wind and Rain and also the Trois Sisters. And it's basically about two women that are two-timed by a potential suitor, and one woman drowns the other sister. And there's like all sorts of variations of it. But for the most part, a lot of the variations like pit the two sisters together. And I'm turning this around in my head and I'm like, I need a villain for my gothic horror novel. And I love the concept of sisters. Like I have a sister myself and I have a great relationship with my sister. But even still having a great relationship with my sister, I'm also very interested in the idea of just like strong female friendships that replicate sisterhood or like different forms of sisterhood. So it just sort of steamrolled into this, like, I'm going to have this pair of two sisters and they're, well, I don't want to spoil too much, but they're going to get essentially like kind of two-timed by somebody, not necessarily romantically, but they're being pitted against one another. And then it just sort of worked out that like another set of sisters came into the plot. And I realized I could sort of like double down on that idea. And yeah, it was really fun to play with. Well, one could argue that like Blake clearly does not get her happily ever after, but in a way, both sets of sisters do triumph over like the person who is trying to pit them all against each other and come out on top. And that is thwarted. So, yeah, I don't know if I actually answered the original question, but I think I did.
Oh, yeah. No, I was actually looking at, so you're talking about Literary Witches. I guess what I'm looking at is the deck.
Yes, there's a card deck as well, but the card deck was published after this little coffee table book. So it was written by, let's see, I can tell you.
This is Thais. Yes. Oh, boy, I don't know if I can pronounce that.
It's a tough name to say.
Thaisia, I guess, and then I'm lost on the last name. Yeah, I can't even.
Kitazakia. Taisia Kitazakia. Yeah, so if you're a woman writer, female writer, or just a writer in general that like likes a lot of the, there's like Emily Dickinson is in the book, Maya Angelou. Shirley Jackson, Sylvia Plath. It's really cool book and Oracle deck. And then, yeah, like I said, Katie Horan's artwork is just really cool. She does like greeting cards and prints, and they're great. Very much a dark mind.
Nice. All about the dark mind.
Yes.
Well, you briefly alluded to your addictive behavior. Do you find it manifesting in especially artistic pursuits like your writing? Like if you don't get to write, or if you write on a schedule and something happens where you don't get to, do you start getting a little sketchy, like, oh, I didn't get to write today? Or
Absolutely. I am so glad you asked me this question, because I've never actually said this out loud before, but I just recently, because I'm working on a new novel now. So Daughters of Black Island came out this past December. I have another novel already finished that's at proofreading stage right now that's coming out this December. But I'm working on a new novel that's very, very new. So I'm in that first draft process where I'm trying to generate about 1,200 words a day is usually my sweet spot.
Wow.
And, I realized a couple weeks ago, you're in recovery. Do you remember waking up those mornings and the shit from the night before comes back to you and you're like, oh my God, what did I do? How much did I mess things up? Why are you so terrible? Why did you do this? Why? I do that to myself. So I got up at 5 a.m. The dog woke me up. I went to the bathroom, took her out to go to the bathroom. And I'm realizing that the thoughts in my head are you didn't get your 1,200 words done last night. You didn't even try to get down. You just went to bed. Oh, God. And the anxiety and the and I mean, let me make one thing perfectly clear. It's nowhere near the anxiety. It's kind of, I would argue, healthy anxiety. I feel I use it to challenge myself. But yeah, the answer to your question is I absolutely think that I've channeled all of that energy into this writing, all the creative pursuits that go along with it. And yeah, I mean, we're talking through it right now, and one could argue that it's a little bit of a dangerous place to kind of think of it like that. But I mean, I've been operating that way for 10 years now, and it's working out pretty well for me. I haven't really found any downsides to being addicted to. I will say, when I first started writing, I wrote a lot of short fiction when I started out. And I do think that the submission process was sort of becoming this evil entity of addiction. It was finish the story and then submit it everywhere and then collect the rejections and feel awful about yourself and then submit it in a whole bunch of other places. But I don't do as much of that anymore. So it was just very early on, I was sort of mirroring the old ugly behaviors with I'm gonna, have this no delay of gratification, no impulse control, must send all of my work out into the world and get feedback, validation.
Yeah. Yeah. Luckily enough, with a podcast, I'm releasing one episode a week, so I kind of get that weekly charge. I couldn't imagine writing a novel and having to delay gratification for so long.
Yes.
But yeah, I kind of agree with you that it's in most cases, pretty much myself and everybody in recovery I know, they've basically sublimated the unhealthy impulse into something that's healthy. I don't know. Are you familiar with that book, Drop the Rock?
I don't think I am. No.
It's based on steps 6 and 7, and it's all about emotional sobriety, and I hate it.
Oh, gosh.
It makes me feel bad about myself because I still have addictive behavior.
Removing character defects. I see it now. Yeah,
yes.
that's so funny.
I hate that book because it tells you to just live moderation across the board. And I was no, I want spikes. I want to feel alive.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I always kind of approach that one as it's enough to have changed the active addictive behaviors and the actual using of substances. As long as you are aware of your character defects, it's usually enough to keep them. I mean, of course, that varies from person to person, but yeah, that's so funny.
Yeah. Well, from what I understand, Whitehall itself is based on a real place. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So also at the same sort of stage of the writing process where I was feeling out, the meta versus, where I was going to go with that and what this story was going to look like with these pairs of sisters. And I was pretty certain I was going to set it on Block Island. I played a little bit with the idea of Martha's Vineyard. And then I played very briefly with the idea of setting it in my hometown, which is Westerly, Rhode Island. And Westerly is certainly not isolated because it's just part of the mainland. It's in southern Rhode Island and it's right on the border of Connecticut. But in the winter, it becomes an entirely different place from what it is in the summer because it's very much a beach community. We have a ton of tourism. We have, a whole miles long strip of beaches on one side of our town. And in the winter, it's just, none of that. But it was not isolated enough for me. So I settled on Block Island, but then I came into the problem of but I want that Gothic mansion. I want that Gothic castle. I want the Abbey in, the Scottish, how could I make that happen on Block Island? And I was going to just make something up on a corner of the island. And I really do not remember at this point when and how I stumbled on it, but I stumbled across the existence of Whitehall on the internet on this blog that I just happened to find. And I was like, oh my God, this is perfect. So unfortunately, in the mid 1900s, the mansion burned down. The only thing that's left of it today are some pieces of crumbling foundation and the 2 entry pillars that I actually mentioned in the book. And it's funny because I've done a lot of events at bookstores in Rhode Island, and a lot of people did not realize, a lot of people from this area will go to Block Island at some point, whether they go every year, every couple years, people from Rhode Island usually end up on Block Island to, hang out one point or another. And tons of people know about Mansion Beach, but so many people were like, I didn't know that Mansion Beach was called Mansion Beach because there used to be a mansion there. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, this mansion was built by Edward Searles right around 1890. It was started a little bit before then, finished a little bit after then. And it was built for his new wife, Mary Searles. And their relationship was I didn't get too much into it in the afterword of the book, but they had a strange relationship. She had an adopted son that she sort of screwed out of money in her will when she married Edward Searles, which was very inexplicable because Edward had a ton of money himself. So I thought that was interesting since there was elements of adoption and unfairness, perceived unfairness within my book. So yeah, this mansion was built and everybody on the island immediately started calling it Searles's Folly because it was just a kind of a ridiculous thing to have on this very rugged, very nautical, very quintessential New England place. My favorite, and this line made its way into the book, but I had this little Block Island guide that I got my hands on that had chapters on all different things and had a chapter on Whitehall. And it called the mansion a pile of ornate splendor. And I just love that so much because it's this if you look at pictures of it online, it's got a lot of sharp, blunt edges to it. It sort of looks almost like a child could have built it with blocks, but it's also
it's
very
sandcastle.
Yeah, but it's got a spookiness to it. In the first chapter, Blake is talking about it with the cab driver that picks her up, Sarah, who becomes a bigger character as the book goes on. And, Sarah tells her it's rusticated wood, which looks like stone, but it's actually made of rusticated wood. So it has this sort of ethereal quality to it. It looks like it doesn't belong where it was. And that little replica mansion that I bring into the book also existed. So it was just this perfect setting dropped into my lap. So I resurrected it for the purposes of my novel and then spend a lengthy time in the afterword explaining what exactly was fact and what was fiction.
Yeah, I was looking at it. So Block Island is, you say it's beach tourism. So this is spring break style spot that people go to?
Yeah, it definitely has a big element of that. But it also has a big draw for just families going. There's moped and bicycle rentals and, there's little shops. It's kind of maybe 50-50, spring break kind of college kids from URI going to party in the summer and families going stay at Airbnbs and use the beaches and hike. And there's a huge draw for nature enthusiasts. There's a lot of protected land and preserves and birding sanctuaries on the island. So it's a big draw for photographers. And there's a couple different elements of tourism to the island in the summertime. In the wintertime, it's pretty dead. A lot of days the ferry doesn't even run.
Well, you have a very literary style of writing with rich descriptions of both characters and settings. And a great example of this would be, this is when Blake first gets to Whitehall and she's being led upstairs to her room. She notices the painting of Refresh my
Mary Searles.
Mary Searles, yeah. And the description states, her hair is glossy and pulled into 3 distinct wavy coifs, and the bodice of her dress features satin buttons, gimp embroidery, and a collar of Alençon lace. And since I'm not familiar with your other work, I'm curious to know if this is your typical literary style or if it's a style adopted specifically for the Gothic tale. And could you expand on your writing style for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like it is probably my default style, like to be a little more wordy and descriptive. And I'd like to bring some elements of research that I've done into the setting and the descriptions. And I mean, I think when I first started writing, I mean, I love horror and thriller and dark and true crime across the board. So I think when I first started writing, I was writing a lot more subgenre. Like I was doing some hardcore horror and some psychological horror and some quiet horror and folk horror and, you know, maybe a little bit of like not fully over the line of like splatterpunk, but I had some sort of like slasher film inspired horror stories. But when I write novels, I have like 2 novels that I've finished previously that I have not published, 2 more that were like unfinished. And then I have the 2 that were with the deal with Thomas and Mercer. And then I have the one that I'm working on now. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, something like 7 or 8 novels. And they're all sort of like within the realm of what this novel is. Like if they're not full on Gothic, like there's Gothic allusions or tones or tendencies or atmospheres. I do like to kind of try to, I guess, weave. I like for things to kind of like going all into the story. So like even like my metaphors. So with this novel, I did a lot of ocean metaphors and descriptions. So like the color of a room was whale gray or seal gray. And like the metaphors were like, you know, looking around the room, pointing a flashlight, like the beam of a lighthouse. I actually don't know if that was actually in this book, but it sounds like something that would have been. The whale gray and the seal gray, I like remember using those descriptions. So then like I wrote a book a few years back that I have not published yet. And there was a lot of bird imagery in it. So it was like, you know, there was plot points that had to do with birds and there were descriptions that had to do. I like to take a manuscript and like drill down into the nitty gritty details, but also pull those details out and try to make the whole experience to kind of fit with the overall like narrative and characters. So yeah, I guess if that ends up being a more literary style, I mean, that's lovely to hear. I'd love to hear that. I'm not the fastest writer. I mean, I guess it takes me like a year to write a novel. Like it takes me about 3 to 5 months to write the first draft. And then I edit it a ton. And then I edit it more. I have a lot of beta readers. I'm very lucky to have a literary agent that like, you know, is a first reader as well. And so, yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to accomplish what I just described and making it feel like an experience rather than just, you know, fast-paced thriller writing.
Yeah.
Which is great too and has its place. And I think my book that's coming out this December, I mean, there's definitely still a lot of elements of what I just described, but I do think in places there's a lot more fast-paced, like not so pretty purple prose writing. And there's a little more of like a pacing, you know, getting to the point kind of a drive. This one, I felt like I could meander a little bit because, you know, the characters and the things going on needed some time to kind of marinate in the horror.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about painting the picture of that setting and atmosphere. And if you want to use painting as a figurative and literal metaphor, you can think about just the fine strokes that I would compare that passage from your book that I just read as just fine strokes painting the picture. And with regard to the atmosphere, one of the very Gothic style elements that Blake makes reference to as making her feel like she's in a Gothic horror novel is the fact that it is always raining. What does the element of rain do for characters and setting to make them exponentially more compelling?
Yeah, so the rain thing kind of started as like a little bit of a joke to myself where like when I was working on the book and it wasn't working and I was like unhappy with it and I felt like it was a little boring. I was just sort of like, it's Gothic. I'm going to make it rain the whole time. Like just because I want to, like just because I want to, it feels very Gothic to me. And then when I made it more meta, I felt like I could play with that even more. I mean, I think the whole novel takes place over I think it's like 3 weeks from like when Blake gets there and writes the letter, and then a week passes, and then Talia gets there, and there's like so it's maybe like 2.5 weeks. And, Block Island is very coastal, and a lot of the coastal areas in Rhode Island, I mean, we certainly get some snow. Sometimes we get a lot of snow, but being near the coast, there are plenty of instances where in the winter where we think we're going to get snow and it becomes rain because of just where we're situated in regards to the ocean. So yeah, I felt like realistically it could rain for 2.5 weeks in Block Island in the winter. And it just felt like, I'm sure we've all had experiences in our lives where like I can think of a time with some writer friends of mine. Actually, we went to the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, and it absolutely poured to the point where like we all had to go to Target and buy new clothes. I'm talking like new underwear, new socks. Like we were thoroughly drenched. And I actually don't have the best memory. Like I have a weird memory. Oftentimes I don't remember details from things, but I find that oftentimes things that happened to me in pouring rain, it's like something about it heightens the experience and I remember it very vividly. Like I remember walking through a park in Boston that day in the rain. I remember like getting to the Target that we went to like buy these new clothes. I also had a similar experience at an art museum in Philadelphia where something about art museums and it pouring rain on me must be a thing.
That sounds
I
nice,
just figured
though.
like, yeah, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just figured like I can get away with this realistically in terms of like location and time of year. It'll be a cool thing to like work into the plot in terms of the characters and the meta aspect of it. And it can like heighten, there's like that scene where Blake like trips on the sand gritty walkway and she looks up and the mansion is, looming ahead of her and the moon is out and it's just raining. And I felt like it was yet another way to sort of like add a layer of detail and description to the things that were happening.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of creates a form of free-floating anxiety because it's like an indication that Mother Nature is in charge, whether you want to admit it or not, and even though it's just water, well, it can keep you inside because you don't want to get soaked. You can slip and hurt yourself. Flash flooding can kill you. You can get into a car wreck if you hydroplane, it can make your existence precarious. And there's nothing you can really do about it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And where the mansion is situated in the book is like around these like clay cliffs. So the element of like, it being a more dangerous terrain with all the rain was fun to play with too. Like when they're running through the mulberry tree forest and, there's roots sticking out and puddles and, that was fun to write.
Well, another mysterious character is Martin, who is, I guess you could say he's connected to old money and owns a significant portion of the real estate on the island. Mm-hmm. And according to Martin, who personally knows what Blake believes to be her birth mother, a woman named Maureen, he doesn't ever remember her having a second child. And he would definitely know, considering he's been the woman's employer for most of her life, including the time period when she would have been pregnant with Blake. However, he takes her to meet Maureen on her day off, and Blake is met with Maureen's complete denial of her being her mother. And being an alcoholic, Blake is severely sensitive to rejection in any form, and perceiving that she's been rejected by her own mother is probably the ultimate form of rejection. So how does the theme of rejection play a central role in this narrative, particularly in relation to Blake's personal struggles and history?
Yeah, I think when I was putting together the character of Blake and like figuring out who she was going to be, I knew for the whole thing to work and to make sense and for everything that comes later in the book and everything that came, before from when she was born to, the moment when she gets to the island, I knew that her pain and the things that were driving her had to be multifaceted. Like if she were just somebody who had struggled with substance abuse and was finding recovery, but like she had this really supportive adoptive family back in Boston, then the book doesn't really work because, if it all falls apart on Block Island and she goes home and, she has Thanksgiving dinner with her lovely family and like, yeah, it sucks. It didn't work out. Or if she had the whole, I was never adopted and I grew up in foster care and I've got this roommate in South Boston and like a few friends and not much else, but I'm not struggling with substance abuse. There's not that like element of danger of relapse. So it kind of loses its like immediacy and the stakes. And then, so one of the things that drove her character and the intersection of her with Talia and Maureen was the idea that, and I mentioned like I have a history of both substance abuse treatment myself. So I met tons of people in treatment, all various types of treatment. And I listened to hundreds of people as a counselor. And so without like getting too crazy into details, of course, but something that I had come across was the idea of a woman being in a situation where she has more than one child and is able to keep one and not the other, and how tough that would be for everyone involved, and the things that might have happened to cause that to be the path that one has to take. So the idea of that was something that like I wanted to explore with these three characters, and how it, manifested, how that like pain and rejection, and on Maureen's part, like the heartbreak of having to do that, and what would have driven a mother to make that decision has to be something that's like pretty significant. So yeah, the whole rejection piece for Blake. And I mean, there's also just an element of like, when you're in early recovery, like everything seems like a giant hurdle to overcome. So the idea of like meeting your birth mother and having her still not be willing to like acknowledge at the very least and accept at the, best case scenario, well, I guess love at the best case scenario, that just seemed like the ultimate thing that would be like really, really hard to deal with. 30, what is she, 30, 60 days? I don't know. She's 30 days, right?
30
She's
days,
got her, yeah.
She's got her desire chip.
The little chip, right? So, yeah, I mean, God, tons of people go back out and relapse after 30 days because like they stubbed their toe. Like that's it happens. Like you can look for any. So I wanted it to be, something really just soul crushing for her to have to try to navigate.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember when Tom Arnold and Roseanne Barr were together. Mm-hmm. They both, had issues with substance abuse. And I was listening to Tom Arnold on a podcast talking about the early days of sobriety where your emotions are just frayed and you're so sensitive. You'll be sitting at the dinner table. Somebody will be like, will you pass the salt? And you scream at them, I am not a loser.
Right. Like... Yes, right. So exactly that. So think about that, but somebody essentially telling you, you are a loser. Like I'm your mother and I'm not even going to admit it. Like that's, how do you, gosh. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Well, to make matters worse, Blake begins to question her own sanity because she's been hearing strange noises and seeing apparitions of some strange being in her room at the bed and breakfast. And there is purportedly a ghost called the Mulberry Maiden that roams the halls of Whitehall. Is there a real-life basis for the Mulberry Maiden, as there is for Whitehall?
So this is like the one question that you've asked me so far where there's like no good backstory. Straight up answer is just I made her up.
Nice.
That one is pure fiction. I just wanted a cool ghost. Actually, I can't even say that. We're such products, right, of everything we consume and all our inspirations. I will say she is heavily, heavily inspired by the ghosts in Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. Because I adore that movie. I know some people don't like it and give it a bad rap. But the costumes and the house, so I said earlier, I love me a good, crumbling Gothic mansion. The house in Crimson Peak is just, chef's kiss. I would live there. It's falling apart around you. Snow is constantly trickling down into the foyer. It's fantastic. And the ghosts in that are, really cool. So that was, in the back of my mind when I was writing her.
Gotcha. Well played. Throughout the story, Blake faces the looming threat of a legal case related to her alcoholism, which emphasizes the gravity of her need to stay sober. So not only is she at risk of relapsing, she's at risk of making her legal issues much worse. There is mention of both genetic and definitely existential reasons for her addiction. So, do you think addicts need only one of those predispositions? And if so, which one? Or do you think they need both? And can you kind of expand on your personal understanding or theory?
I think they only need one.
Mm-hmm.
I think if they have both, it's twice as difficult to not go down that path. And so, like, to talk about it in terms of the novel, like, so, Maureen struggles a lot with substance abuse, and I was trying to write it as if Blake has the nature element to it, where it's a genetic predisposition. And then she has, all of the risk factors in terms of like nurture, growing up in an unsupportive environment without proper support system, having a lot of stressors in her life, having not the best resiliency and coping mechanisms. So in her case, I tried to write it as if it was like the worst of both worlds colliding, like horrible nature element, horrible nurture element, and explode them together. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation to have. There's tons of research on like both sides of it in terms of like only one matters, only the other matters, neither of them matter, both of them matter. But yeah, I'm pretty inclined to believe that it can be one, it can be the other, it can be both. It can't be none. Like, right? Then you're just not an addict. Then you're like having a nice mimosa at brunch somewhere right now. Like, kudos to you.
Well, at the end of part one of the story, we encounter the murder of Blake, which I don't think is a spoiler because it's in the description of the book.
No, it's on the back of the book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, everyone.
So we encounter the murder of Blake as she relaxes in a clawfoot tub after sending a letter to her sister, Talia, whose address was provided to her by Martin. It's unclear whether the person who killed her was real or supernatural, but the accused individual has a logical reason to harbor resentment toward her. And at this point, Talia enters the picture, and it almost seems as though she's chasing a ghost, even though everyone on the island interacted with Blake in person. So how did you approach using the arrival and aftermath of Blake's stay on the island to maintain her character in this essence that Talia could basically interact with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I always knew I wanted that element to be there. But I think it's something that really only came fully together with each subsequent rewrite. Like, I remember still kind of honing that piece of it on like very late stage edits. And one of the pieces of that, I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, was like, originally I was like, when Blake writes the letter to Talia, like, should I just have her be reading the letter in her mind as she's writing it, and the reader gets what she put in that letter as Blake is writing it? And then I was like, no, that's the worst way to unveil it. Like, you're not going to get to read what Blake wrote until Talia herself, like, pulls out the letter later to use it to help her navigate what happened to Blake. And then I also touched on this a little bit, but like the establishment of those rules of surviving a Gothic horror novel that Blake comes up with, and then she like jokingly writes down and sticks it in the book that she's reading, and then Talia finds it. That was another way to kind of bring her voice back into the second half. And I think it was really important to establish, like I also mentioned earlier with Maureen, and the decision that she had to make in terms of like one daughter versus the other and how to keep them both safe, and the best way that she could figure out to do that. The fact that like there was love for Blake from Maureen, and there was love for Blake from Talia that sort of grew as she was learning more about her and realizing what had happened to her. So I think those were like the main ways that I tried to keep her presence alive. And like, I really love that, like chasing a ghost, like that is what she was doing. And that's why I felt really strongly about ending the book. I mean, this is like kind of a spoiler, but I won't say who. Like, there's a scene at the end of the book where characters visit Blake's grave, and it's a very cathartic and kind of full circle moment, but also a beginning to kind of like move on from everything that happened. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like collectively these traces of her kind of outline this ethereal essence, like the taxi driver interacted with her. Eileen
Yes.
and Fiona interacted with her. The creepy guy that owned the other hotel or whatever interacted with her. There was just these traces of interaction all over the island that she was finding out about afterwards. So it's like she was still there. She was, still communicating with her in a sense.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. That's great. That's what I was hoping would come out of those interactions.
Well, when it comes to Martin, when Blake initially got onto the island, Martin helped her out a lot, giving her rides, taking her to actually see Maureen and helping her, track down leads that she found out about. Talia doesn't have the same close interaction with Martin that Blake did, but he's always looming in the background, it seems like. And he's referred to as the town selectman. Can you tell us a little bit about his ties to the old money of the town and what a selectman is, as I'm not really familiar with that term?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, I'm not the most familiar with it as well. I just know that because Block Island's sort of town infrastructure is a lot smaller, that it's a position that numerous people have held over the years, and it's a position of power and like decision-making privilege. So I actually didn't do as much research into that, like just for the purposes that I needed to do for the book. Like this was something that exists on Block Island. He was going to be it. Here's the privilege that it affords him. And yeah, like the idea of him being connected to old money. I don't know if people are familiar, but Rhode Island, we have like this whole separate from our beaches, this whole separate tourism economy in Newport. We have these Newport mansions. And so it's like the Belmont, the Breakers, Rose Cliff, Seaview Terrace. Well, Seaview Terrace is actually privately owned. That is not one of the publicly maintained mansions. But there was a lot of old money in Rhode Island and family and generational occupation of houses, mansions, monstrosities that were built in the state. And, there wasn't quite that element to Whitehall. Like it was really only built and owned by the Searles. And then it sort of changed hands two other times, but not like within the family. And it didn't have that richness of history. So I did kind of borrow that piece from nearby Newport with the, like the Rockefellers, all these famous old money, oil, wealthy beyond imagination families that these mansions were passed from one generation to the next, and then eventually made their way into the hands of the state and are now publicly maintained as museums. I actually just went to visit the Newport mansions with my daughter a couple weeks ago.
Nice.
So they're very, very fun. I guess now too, they're doing some like reenactments with actors, and they're not open yet, I guess in the summer months. I'm going to have to go and see some of those because that sounds fun.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, this is a great example of a story that leads you to believe you know how the story is going to end and what's going on, and does it multiple times before it finally clocks you on the head with the big finale. So you mentioned it takes about a year for you to write, I guess 3 months, you said, to get the first draft, multiple rough drafts, and so on. What is your outlining process, if any, when it comes to crafting multiple plot twists?
A bit of a like knife in my side question in a way, because like when I first started writing novels, I fantasized about being way more of like an Agatha Christie type writer than I am naturally inclined to be. So I wanted to be that. Like I thought I want to be like a horror writer, but I also want to do like thriller and mystery and suspense. And I want to be able to do that plot twist. And I think, Daughters of Black Island, like you said, it has plot twists, but I am not a writer who sits down and I'm like, let me piece this together like a puzzle. I am more the person who sits down and like writes a story and sees where the characters go and comes up with things along the way. And then at the end, or not necessarily at the end, but along the way, as things really start to take shape, I make connections and I manipulate things a little bit more and I create those twists. So I appreciate hearing that you felt like this made a bunch of like 180s along the way. In terms of an outline, I don't know that I would say what I do is outline. I think what happens is when I start working on a new novel, I think about it a lot. And I think about like what I want to happen and what direction I want the characters to go in. And then like while I'm in that process, that like early brainstorming process, I mentioned earlier, like I don't have the best memory. I'm usually thinking of too many things in a given day. So I have to write things down. And I start to get nervous that like if I come up with a good connection, like, oh, at the 3/4 mark, this character and this character are going to come together and do this. That'll be great. And I've learned about myself now that even if it's like a very great idea and it's something that's like pretty organic from like where the story has progressed to, I still have the potential to forget it. So what I do is a lot of like note taking, like not outlining as to like what I want the story to look like. And, chapter 3 is going to include this and chapter 4 is going to include this. It's like these like text messages to myself in my phone and like little track change OneNotes throughout the document. Like, oh, you can use this breadcrumb to do this later reveal that you want to have. Like, I just leave myself a lot of like breadcrumbs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like Hansel and Gretel, making my way in the forest. I'm going to forget how I got there. I need the breadcrumbs to get myself out. So yeah, I just make little notes along the way and kind of stream of consciousness. Like, what do I want to accomplish in this book with the characters? So yeah, it's my process.
So would you consider yourself more of a pantser then?
I guess like that's the answer. That's the question that like I don't really know the answer to. I guess, but like that feels too chaotic for me. I feel like I'm too much of a type A to be called a pantser. Like I'm like somewhere in the middle.
Well, so the book has a bittersweet ending, as most Gothic novels do. Did you feel a profound sense of lingering loss for Blake, as if she was a real person? And did any of your readers report that as well? Because I did. I don't know if it's, my link as being in recovery. I kind of know how the emotional turmoil and the insecurity can just eat you alive from the inside out.
Yes, the answer is yes and yes. Yes to me and yes to readers.
Okay.
She's very much like one of the most enjoyable characters that I've written and most satisfying. The one that I, did not wish that she would have the fate that she had to have. I talked at an event a couple weeks ago because, readers brought up the same emotions. Like, yeah, I really liked Blake. I wish she didn't have to die.
Yeah.
And they were like, maybe you could write, you write a lot of short fiction, like little prequel things with Blake in them. Like, yeah, you never know. But yeah, she was a bit of a tragic figure and sucks. She was cool. I just felt like she was cool. Like if she had gotten herself together and had been in recovery, like she could have had a lot going for her. But
yeah. Well, it is a great book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. Definitely. I wanted to talk to you about some of your other work. You have a collection of short stories entitled Something Borrowed, Something Blood-Soaked. And I understand that you won the Indie Horror Book Award for debut collection, as well as were nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
So that collection, it's very confusing the way my bio is written sometimes. I wasn't nominated for that. It made the preliminary ballot for the Stokers that year, but I have 2 Stoker nominations now. One is for that addiction horror short story I mentioned that came out last year. And then, Daughters of Block Island was just a couple weeks ago, I found out is officially a nominee for Best First Novel. So that's very exciting.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's just very exciting. Yeah, the collection, it did get that Indie Horror Book Award. It was published with an indie horror publisher, Unnerving. And like I mentioned earlier about when I started writing, the first 5 years that I was writing with the intent of publishing, I wrote kind of all over the map in terms of genre and subgenre. So the reason I entitled it Something Borrowed, Something Blood-Soaked was because I wanted it to have an eclectic feel, like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of... Because, that book really does encompass gothic, psychological, a little more hardcore, slasher feel. There are a lot of horror tropes in it, zombies, witches, ghosts, but I'm not one to just write a monster story. There's a lot of monstrous metaphors in there. So,
well, how did it feel to have, sounds like 2 debut books do extremely well?
I'm very grateful. It's very nice to get award nominations. It's lovely. But what I've tried to take away from it is because they're certainly, subjective. I'm just happy that people anytime somebody reads something that I wrote and writes to me about it and tells me that like they related to it in some way, or like doing a podcast like this with you where you have such wonderful, insightful questions and, related to a character that was in recovery. It's just great. Like I would write even if nobody read it. It wouldn't be as exciting or validating. But yeah, it's just really wonderful. I mean, when the short story collection came out, I had a couple bookstagrammers be like, this was, one of my favorite collections this year because there was so much about relationships and addiction and, like women's issues. And it just really connected with me. And like, clearly I still remember that 5-6 years later because it meant so much to me. So yeah.
Well, the more you talk about it, the collection Orphans of Bliss, Tales of Addiction Horror, can you tell me about, just a little bit about your contribution to that and maybe who else is involved with that project?
Yeah, so the very illustrious editor and writer, Mark Matthews, did a trilogy of addiction anthologies. So the first one was Garden of Fiends. The second one was Lullabies for Suffering. And the third one was Orphans of Bliss. So I was very lucky to be invited to contribute to Orphans of Bliss. There was some really tremendous other authors in it. Gabino Iglesias is one author that comes to mind. S.A. Cosby was in the anthology, who's a phenomenal writer. So yeah, and it's a really cool anthology because, it kind of focuses on substances, but it's eclectic as well. There's like some shopping addiction story. There's a shopping addiction story. There's a couple different stories that aren't straight substance use, which like really, he did a great job editing it. It's got such a nice feel when you read through the whole book. It's very satisfying and like makes you think about a lot of different things. Keelan Patrick Burke, that's another author that's in it. His story in it is amazing. So my story was very much a long time coming. I started actually back when I used to work at methadone clinics. I am a proponent of methadone treatment. I think it absolutely is a great harm reduction treatment. I think for some people, it's the only treatment that is going to work for them. But there was an element of that treatment that like always kind of unnerved me. Like even this was like before I was a horror writer, like something about it always kind of like made me feel uneasy. And I realized later that it was the fact that for people that don't know, by virtue of being on methadone, you are filling the same opioid receptors in your brain, but with a synthetic opioid that is not going to have the same crushing half-life where like the spikes and the cravings of using illicit opiates. But the big but is that like you are still physically, not so much mentally, so you think, physically addicted to an opiate. But what I would see as a methadone clinic counselor was that these people that had been on methadone for like 5, 7, 10, 15 years, when they would try to get off methadone, it was like utterly unnerving to see somebody that had, for all intents and purposes, built a life of recovery. And then were mentally like thrown back into how they were 10, 15 years ago mentally, because no matter how slowly you tapered off of it, the cravings and the desire for more would like creep in. And it was just very terrifying to me to think of like building a life for a decade or more and then having like the rug pulled out from you so utterly, and like it just freaked me out. So going along with that, like when you spend a lot of time in substance abuse treatment, I mean, you're supposed to be doing a lot of introspective work and like thinking about yourself and like where you went wrong and like why you use, why you drink, how are you going to like build a future for yourself? And there was just some element of like always sitting in a detox or in like an early treatment type and being told like, imagine what you could be if you weren't using, like think of the future. And like, there's just all these elements of like forward thinking and like building on, one step at a time. Like usually people who aren't even in AA have heard that one.
Yeah.
So the story, to bring it back to your question, my story in the anthology, it's a Black Mirror-esque where there's an element of virtual reality recovery. So this girl is in detox and she's given the option to see what her recovery would be like however many years in the future. So she can choose to take part in this virtual reality simulation to actually see what these counselors are telling her. Like, if you can just stay sober, here are the things that you can accomplish. But okay, like, here's the ability to see that. And, I went a little bit sci-fi in that, like, you're supposed to feed this VR system, like, your past, treatment notes and your DNA and like all these things so that it can like predict what that future in recovery might look like. But then it just gets really dark because it's like, what's real and what's not? Like, what are you building your recovery foundation on? Like, what happens if that's taken away from you?
Yeah.
So yeah, even with these novels that I'm writing, it's probably the short story that I'm most proud of because I just really put a lot into it. And it really was the culmination of like multiple years in treatment and then 10 years in recovery and just like thinking about what those things mean.
Yeah, my drug of choice, of course, was alcohol, but all of the people I knew in recovery that had issues with opiates, I never really met any of them that were on methadone. They were all taking Suboxone.
Which has a similar pitfall. Not quite as dramatic and drastic, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it still seemed like they caught hell trying to get off that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yep, it's a tough one. But, for some people, it's that bridge that they need. And for some people, it becomes handcuffs. I have another short story that I wrote years ago that also has a bit to do with both methadone and just heroin because I worked at a methadone clinic and I saw a lot of people and all their different takes on it. And the story is called Liquid Handcuffs. And I actually think it works better for methadone than heroin. Like liquid handcuffs, you're handcuffed to this stuff if you want your recovery to work. So,
well, being from Rhode Island, I imagine you're a Lovecraft fan, HP? And if so, which kind of Lovecraftian related sites or activities are there available in Rhode Island?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would call myself a fan. It's impossible to really be a horror writer, and especially a horror writer in Rhode Island that's not influenced by him in some way.
Yeah.
I actually just posted about this on Facebook this past week. My daughter, she's 3, she's almost 4, and she loves stories and books, and she's into like villains and stories about like good versus evil. And we have a long drive to school in the morning. She always wants me to make up a story for her. And so just this past week, I like needed a good villain. So I explained to her like who Lovecraft was. Because, she knows I'm a writer. She understands that like writers are the ones that come up with these stories. So I like explained who Lovecraft was and explained about Cthulhu. And so the story we told was actually like the Paw Patrol taking Cthulhu down. So clearly I am influenced by Lovecraft.
Oh, you have to write that. You need to write that and submit it.
I know. Hilarious. Good stuff. But Necronomicon is a convention that's held every 2 years in Providence, and it is just so much fun. It's a huge dark fiction, horror, weird fiction convention, and it brings together writers and artists and filmmakers. And so it's obviously stemming from the celebration of Lovecraft, but, he can be problematic as well. A lot of his stories were very racist, and I don't think he has a single female character. So I think the convention and Providence in general, they've done a good job of acknowledging that and like finding ways to work past it while giving the people that he was discriminatory against their due and a good way of like celebrating him, but also acknowledging the problematic stuff. So the convention is great. It's actually taking place. This is an on year for it since it's every other year. So August 2024, any listeners that are in the Rhode Island area, they have day passes and full convention passes, and it's a good time.
Nice. Well, what is the life of Christa Carmen like outside of writing?
I mentioned I have a daughter, so I spend a lot of time telling stories with her. And, she came with me to the Newport Mansions a couple weeks ago and was really into that. We're big outdoor people. Like we've got a dog that we take on walks and hikes a lot and just got some new baby chicks. We're raising some chickens in the yard and trying to do fun stuff like that. A lot of gardening. I do have a full-time job. I work at Pfizer in clinical trial research. I'm a supply chain lead. I live in Rhode Island. So like, it's funny because like, I think like some of the stereotypical horror writer, like want to be a vampire, hide from the sun. Like I grew up going to the beach and like we boat a lot in the summer. A lot of my friends have boats and family members and just living life, hanging out with family. I do love to hang out with other writers. I'm traveling a lot for a lot of different conventions this year, going to Necronomicon, going to StokerCon in San Diego. I got to update the events page of my website because there's a couple other events. The Salem Horror Fest at the end of April, beginning of May. I'm going to be doing a reading there. So yeah, I like doing that stuff as well.
All right. Well, Christa, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so very much. It's a real, true joy to record a podcast with somebody who takes clearly as much time reading the material and cultivating the questions. And just, thank you so much. It was great. And it was great to talk some, can you say it, addiction shop?
Recovery shop.
Shop with you.
Yes, ma'am.
Congrats on 11 years.
And you the same on 10. And I appreciate you saying all those nice things.
Of course.
Well, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about? I know you mentioned a few things, so maybe some things you want to reiterate.
Yeah, this will be the kick in the butt that I need to update my website. And there will be events that I'm doing this year. And I do have a fair amount of short stories coming out in different anthologies this year. But I think the biggest thing is that my next novel will be coming out this December. It's called Beneath the Poet's House, and it is set in Providence, Rhode Island. And it is sort of a modern day residual haunting of Edgar Allan Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman that takes place on Benefit Street in Providence with a modern day cast. And with plenty of gothic details and creepy old houses and all of the like.
All right. Look forward to that. So, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Christa, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so very much.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday when I will be joined by a writer of dark fantasy that has radically reinterpreted the vampire archetype. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.
Are we better than before? At being honest and straightforward, can we care a little more before we run out of answers? 'Cause